Our text this afternoon is John's Gospel, chapter 18, and verses 28 to 32. John 18, 28 to 32. The apostle writes, "Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning, but they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out to them and said, 'What accusation do you bring against this man?' They answered and said to him, 'If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you.' Then Pilate said to them, 'You take him and judge him according to your law.' Therefore the Jews said to him, 'It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die.'" This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. Well, we come today to one of the most tragic and ironic exchanges in all of redemptive history. Jesus, the sinless Son of God, the Lamb without blemish or spot, is brought before a pagan ruler by the Jewish leaders, who were the ones who were supposed to be devoted to the law of the Lord. They should have led their people in the way of God, in what the prophets had revealed. Indeed, these people, Caiaphas and Annas of all people, should have been the very first ones to bow the knee to the Lord Jesus and confess him as their Messiah. But instead, they hand him over to Pontius Pilate. Everything in this text is turned upside down. Justice is inverted and the truth is twisted. The innocent one is accused of evil, while the wicked are cloaked in religious ceremony. And yet, through it all, the sovereign plan of God is unfolding to the letter, even down to the method of Christ's execution, as we shall see. Jesus had to die on the tree. There was no other way. This is not only what was prophesied, of course it was prophesied, but there's a theological reason as well. And for these people to come to Pilate and to hand Jesus over to Pilate, well, Pilate was the only one who had the authority to kill by crucifixion. They did not. And so our text begins today by stating that they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters, the praetorium. But before we understand why they did that, you might have noticed something really strange here. 3 weeks ago, we were looking at verse 24. Look there with me. "Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest." So, as we had learned, Jesus was on trial before Annas, a secret trial, for most of the night. This was by far the longest period that Jesus spent during his trial was before Annas. Then the rooster crows. Annas sends him bound to Caiaphas. But then, 2 weeks ago, we learned about Simon Peter's denial of Jesus. And then in verse 28 today, it says, "Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium." That's really interesting. What about the trial before Caiaphas? All of the synoptic gospels talk about this trial. John does not. He leaves it out entirely. Why is that the case? Well, John is being intentionally selective in his narration. Skipping the formal trial before Caiaphas was a purposeful and even theological decision. I want to cover just a couple of reasons why I think John may have omitted the detailed account of Jesus' trial before Caiaphas. If you want to read that, you can do so in Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22. All of those Gospels talk about the false witnesses who couldn't get their testimonies to agree, and Caiaphas accusing Jesus of blasphemy and tearing his robe. And then even that, at the end of Matthew 26, it talks about how then these men start beating Jesus with their fists. But John doesn't mention that. It's because his aim is to present Jesus as the Son of God, who is rejected by the world, who willingly laid down his life. And in John's gospel, the trial that matters the most is the one where he confronts the world powers represented by Pontius Pilate. This actually fits with John's overarching purpose. These things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And so John brings us into Jesus' interactions with Pilate and not Caiaphas, because that is where this theological drama unfolds, where the King of Truth is standing before the rulers of this world. Of course, John's gospel was written decades after the Synoptic Gospels were written, and so those events that were recorded there were already well known. Now, John doesn't ignore Caiaphas. Indeed, he's the one that highlights something that the Synoptic Gospels don't. You'll remember, Caiaphas unwittingly prophesied Jesus' substitutionary death, and he said, "It is better for you that one man should die for the people than that the whole nation should perish." And John comments, he did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. That's John 11 and 51. So this shows John's deeper theological concern, which was not just the mechanics of the trial before Caiaphas, but the spiritual meaning of Christ's death. And then finally, and then I'll get off of this, finally, John highlights Jesus' sovereignty and not his condemnation. In the Synoptic Gospels, the trial before Caiaphas is full of injustice and false witnesses and human manipulation. But as we've been going through this last 24 hours of Jesus' life, what have you seen? Jesus is in complete control over all of it. When they arrest him in the garden, he asked them, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And then he said, "I am." And as soon as Jesus says that, they all fall backwards and fall to the ground. This is not a person who is out of control. He's not a victim of his circumstance. He says, "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord." Jesus tells Peter, "Shall I not drink the cup that my Father has given to me?" This is voluntary. Christ is purposely being led. When it says here, even in our text, in verse 38, that Jesus was being led into the praetorium, he's voluntarily led, voluntarily bound, voluntarily on trial, even voluntarily struck by these wicked men. Jesus tells Pontius Pilate later in John 19:11, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above." And so, the apostles' aim here is to show Jesus not as a victim, but as the willing and sovereign Lamb of God, steering the events of his passion. Very well. So it says in our text that Jesus was led into the praetorium. The praetorium was basically Pontius Pilate's house. He lived there. He conducted his official business there for the Roman authorities. He was appointed by Rome to be the governor of Judea and Samaria in a place called Idumea. But I think it's important for us to know a little bit about who Pontius Pilate was. I mean, we talk about him every morning at my church where we read the Apostles' Creed. He suffered under Pontius Pilate. That the earliest church acknowledged this, and particularly this man. So who was Pilate? Well, Pilate was the Roman governor, or the prefect of Judea, from AD 26 to AD 36. He spent just about 10 years there, serving under the Emperor Tiberius Caesar. And his primary role was to maintain order, to oversee Roman justice, and to collect the taxes in this volatile province. This was not probably a place that a Roman governor wanted to be assigned to. Right? The reason why is not because Israel isn't beautiful, although I've never been, but maybe we can change that. The reason was because the Jewish people never really liked being ruled by foreign rulers, okay? And they would rebel against them. There were a number of groups that rose up, the Sicarii, people who were assassins who would go and try to disrupt the Roman authorities wherever they could, and zealots. In fact, a zealot was called by Jesus to become one of the disciples, Simon the Zealot. I've always said, when Jesus is talking with the disciples in the Last Supper, and they're all saying, "Is it I, Lord?" I bet Simon the Zealot was looking at Matthew the tax collector and thinking, that's the guy, he's the one who's going to betray Jesus, because he betrayed all of us being a tax collector. Right? So there were zealots, there were uprisings, various different uprisings, and so Pilate didn't really like this assignment. And his time in office was marked by tension with the Jewish population due to his insensitivity to their religious practices. He's a pagan, total pagan, and he looked down upon them. He was appointed by the Roman by the Roman emperor, rather, but unlike the Herod family, you remember the Herods were client kings. They ruled semi-autonomously. Herod Antipas and his father Herod the Great, and there were a couple other Herods, Philip, for instance. Unlike them, Pilate was a direct Roman appointee. He was a governor rather than a king. He was accountable to Caesar. And the authorities of the nation knew that, and they're going to use that to their advantage here in the trial of Jesus, because they knew that his tenure had already been kind of rocky. And so later on, when they're going to say, anyone who doesn't basically condemn Jesus is no friend to Caesar, he takes that as a kind of a threat from them, that maybe they'll go and give a report about how bad he is and he'll be removed. Indeed, not very long after this, he was removed, just about 3 years later. So early in the morning, the text says that the religious leaders brought Jesus into Pilate's headquarters. Now, this is also interesting because in the very last verse that we were looking at, what happened? What happened with the rooster? The rooster crowed. Right after the rooster crowed is when this text picks up. So this is very early in the morning, probably 4:30, 5, maybe 5:30 in the morning. We know from another text that Pilate's wife could not sleep during the night, so ostensibly she was tossing and turning all night. Do you think Pilate wanted to wake up and deal with this at the crack of dawn? I mean, just imagine the scene. I want to paint for you the white parts of the Bible here, right? He hears, "What? Mr. Pilate, there's some people who are outside at the gate, some big crowd, and they have a man there with him, and they need you to adjudicate this situation out here. It's like 5 o'clock in the morning. What are you waking me up for? Bring them in?" No. They won't come in. Actually, they're going to stay outside. They want you to go outside and meet them, like in the cold, crisp, early morning air. Oh, I think he would already be in quite a bad mood. The second half of verse 28 says, "They themselves did not enter into the praetorium," look at this, "so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover." There's a couple other things here before we even go on that I want to mention, and it's this. Eat the Passover? Well, what was the night before? Wasn't that the Passover? And Jesus ate the Passover meal. That's the Last Supper, is a Passover meal. Communion commemorates a Passover meal. And so Jesus has already eaten the Passover meal. This is the next day. And here it says in the text, they didn't want to enter into a Gentile's house so that they wouldn't be defiled, so that they could be able to eat the Passover. Do you know, I saw this in the text, and I said, I'm going to consult a bunch of my commentaries and see what the commentaries have to say about this. Wow, I didn't realize there is a big, debate over just that they wouldn't be defiled in order to eat the Passover. Okay? Did John get his timeline wrong? What's going on here? Of course not. John knew exactly what he was writing. There are two explanations. One of them is this, that there was a Galilean celebration of the Passover that was different from the Judean celebration of the Passover. And since Jesus and the disciples were from up in Galilee and they came down, they decided to celebrate the Galilean calendar instead of the Judean one. I don't know if that's quite convincing. I think Michael Rydelnik holds that position. But there's another explanation, and it's this, that right after the Passover is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then right after that is the Feast of First Fruits. And this holiday is going on for an entire week. Okay? So we don't need to get caught up and think there's a problem with the text. No, it's just that very next day there was going to be another celebration, another meal. That's what they're talking about here. But I don't want you to miss the forest for the trees. They didn't enter the praetorium so that they would not be defiled, so that they could eat the Passover. Look at this stunning hypocrisy. The religious leaders who have just conspired to murder the only innocent, truly innocent man ever, are now deeply concerned about their ceremonial cleanliness, how they strain a gnat and swallow the biggest camel there ever was. This is so typical of the Pharisaical leadership, though. Scrupulous about external defilement, while their hearts were overflowing with hatred and envy and murder. Listen to what Jesus says about these people in Matthew 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. These are the ones who honor God with their lips, but their hearts are far from him. They would not enter into the Gentiles' home, fearing it would make them unclean for Passover, and yet they are in the process of unjustly delivering the true Passover lamb to be slain. What blindness and hardness of heart. So I think that there's an application here for us, friends, that we may strive not to fall into this kind of hypocrisy, that we must guard our own hearts against it, against this idea where we maintain a facade of spiritual devotion while ignoring the weightier matters of the heart, justice and mercy and humility. And lest we think that Pharisees only existed back then. There's Pharisees in the church too. That's the truth. There's Pharisees in the church too. And true obedience to God is not merely about external behavior, but rather a heart which is aligned with God. We can avoid this trap by regularly examining ourselves in the light of Scripture, by confessing our sin honestly, first and foremost to God, and by seeking genuine transformation and asking the Lord, preserve me from this. Preserve me from haughtiness. Preserve me from hypocrisy. Preserve me from falling into this trap, which I think is easier than we really realize. This trap of just putting on a Christian face. And putting on a Christian face, especially on Sundays, and then, being something else inside. So verse 29 to 30 says, therefore Pilate went out to them. See, they wouldn't come in. So he goes out, he's putting his robe on, his jacket, and he says to them, what accusation do you bring against this man? And they answered and said to him, if this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. Oh, what a terrible accusation that is. It's not an accusation at all. Well, they say, if he wasn't bad, we wouldn't be here. Okay, what? Okay, so first of all, that passage about the trial of Caiaphas in Matthew's gospel says that they began beating Jesus, punching him with their fists. So we have to imagine that even by this time, Christ's face would have been swollen. He would have been beaten up. His eyes would have been swollen. In Isaiah, it says, I have given my cheeks to those who pluck out the beard. Now, there's nothing that says that in the New Testament, but that is a messianic prophecy, that these men, wretched, wicked, sinful evildoers, are pulling on Jesus' beard, pulling it out. By the time even that Jesus comes to Pilate, Pilate looks at him and he says, what charge do you bring against him? As I said, he must have been annoyed to be woken up by this crowd, bringing a man to him for justice. And the best they have is, if this man were not an evildoer, we wouldn't be here. That's it. This is evasion. The religious leaders cannot provide a legitimate charge. Pilate asks, what accusation do you bring? Their response is essentially, just trust us. If he weren't evil, then, what would we be doing here at 5 o'clock in the morning right now? The Greek word for evil, kakopoios, means malefactor or criminal. If this man wasn't a criminal, we wouldn't be charging him now, would we? In Luke's gospel, Luke fleshes it out more. He records them saying, we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Of course, this is a fabrication. Jesus affirmed paying taxes to Caesar. They tried to trick him and say, is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And Jesus, in just perfect wisdom, says, show me a denarius. Whose picture is on it? Caesar's. Well, then give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give to God what is God's. So he never said don't pay taxes. They're outright lying, first of all. And then, of course, Christ is a king, but not in the way that they insinuated. He said, as we will soon learn, Lord willing, when we study the next few verses, he's going to tell Pontius Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. So then, what evil has this man done? Pilate himself will say about Jesus 3 times, I find no guilt in him. Even Judas, his betrayer, when he throws the money back into the temple that he was paid to betray Jesus, he said, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. The centurion at the cross when Jesus died said, certainly this was a righteous man. Hebrews 7:26 tells us it was fitting for us to have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. So then, what accusation do you bring against this man? There is none. There is no legitimate accusation, no charge that can ever be brought against Jesus Christ. He only ever spoke the truth. No deceit was found in his mouth. Deceit is found in all of our mouths. Every man is a liar, but not Christ. Why? Because out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. But Christ's heart, the only one who ever was on this earth who had a pure heart, is Jesus. Christ's heart only spoke what is truth because there was no corruption in it. There was no sin in it. And so this charge against Jesus, calling him a malefactor, calling him a criminal, is insane.